So yes, if you want to be an academic economist, you have to get used to hard work. But I guess it's true in many other occupations as well. So it's not so unique. Well, to understand what will happen with foreign trade in the years to come, namely to understand where we are heading, we have to understand where we are coming from. And particularly, we have to understand what has been achieved through many years of foreign trade. And for this reason, I will start with some broad historical remarks. Let me see whether this works. Yeah, it works. So what I show you here is a graph that depicts the development of foreign trade in terms of export relative to GDP from the beginning of the 19th century. And the important thing to note is that foreign trade has expanded very rapidly since the beginning of the 19th century. It accounted for about 5% of GDP at the beginning of the century, and it reached 25% in the 21st century. And importantly, this expansion has not been uniform over time. And if you look at this graph in particular, you'll see that between the war, there was a decline in trade relative to GDP. It was driven to a large extent by unfortunate trade policies, not unsimilar to what we observe today. Importantly, again, that trade in manufactures played a central role in this process of development, with services becoming important only recently. So merchandise export totaled approximately $25 trillion in 2002, but export of services, which were negligible in the early 80s, have reached about $7 trillion more recently. And the countries that are the largest traders in the world are China, the United States, and Germany, and Japan, which used to be a big trader, is still large, but not as large as some of the other countries. Globalization in the form of foreign trade was an important enabler of economic growth. And this I cannot really overemphasize how important foreign trade was in driving growth in many countries. Many technological advancements require large-scale markets, which in various single countries are not really large enough to motivate investors to invest in research and development. So market integration provided this scale, and this fostered innovation and productivity growth. And this was indeed a central theme in the growth, in the new growth theory that was developed in the early 90s. Now, after World War II, countries that expanded their exports, they grew faster, as you can see in this graph. So in the cross-section, there's a very strong correlation between growth and openness. Of course, this correlation doesn't determine causation, but we have good enough theories and some other papers on the microeconomics of growth that can provide an explanation of this type of correlation. Another development which is important, and it's important for understanding also where we are heading, is that global income inequality increased over time. And this graph represents the evolution of inequality over time, with a decomposition, which is very important, between the contribution of inequality across countries, which is depicted by the dark bars, and inequality within countries. So what this represents is a decomposition of the movement inequality over time into inequality within countries and inequality between countries. And what you see here is that the rise in inequality until the late 90s was driven primarily by an increase in equality between countries rather than within countries. Since then, inequality has declined in the world economy. This counts essentially every individual as one individual, doesn't matter from which country they come. So this is global inequality in the world. And this decline was driven by narrowing income gaps between countries. What does it mean? It means that poorer countries like Bangladesh and of course China and India, they grew relatively fast, and many other poorer countries, and they closed the income gap with richer countries, and this reduced inequality in the global economy. Now, at the same time, starting in the late 70s, and economic inequality within countries increased as well. And this rise in inequality took place mostly in wealthy countries, but not only in wealthy countries. And this trend led many to attribute growing inequality to globalization. And there has been a huge debate in the economic literature about this trend. However, the evidence does not support this claim. I have in fact written a book called Globalization and Inequality, where I reviewed the entire literature on this subject. And my personal conclusion is that most of the rise in inequality was not driven by globalization. Well, some studies obviously found that foreign trade contributed, especially to wage inequality, so it wasn't entirely innocent. But this contribution to the rise in inequality was relatively small, and most of it, at least by more recent studies, was driven by automation and things of this sort. But concerns about inequality remain widespread, and particularly regarding the world's poorest individual. And this, again, I'm now touching on a subject which is hard to overemphasize. So the World Bank measures extreme poverty as the number of people living on the equivalent of $1 a day in 1990 prices. So this number has been updated to $2.15 a day in 2017 prices. But the point is that if you look at the evolution of this measure of inequality, which is given by this downward sloping orange graph, in the early 80s, more than 50% of the world's population lived with under $1 per day, more than 50%. And this share declined more recently to about 10%. In 2019, it reached 10%. So there was a huge decline in the fraction of people who lived in extreme poverty based on the definition of the World Bank. What it means is that during that period, more than 1 billion people, closer, I think, to 1.4 billion people, were lifted out of this type of extreme poverty. And this dramatic reduction was driven by the rapid growth of the poorer countries. And it is difficult for me and for many other economists to imagine how this progress could have occurred without these countries being integrated into the world trading system. A lot of this growth of the poorer countries was what we call export-driven growth, and it resulted from their integration into the world trading system. Now, the establishment of the international institutions after World War II, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and for our purpose, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, what's called GATT, they played a key role in expanding trade and economic integration, which allowed essentially the growth of these poorer countries and the removal of such large number of people from poverty. Through multiple rounds of negotiations, GATT significantly reduced tariffs, and this culminated in the Uruguay round and the formation of the WTO, the World Trade Organization, in 1995. So if you look, for example, at the average tariff rates in the US, you see the peak approximately towards the end of World War II, and then you see the dramatic decline to an average which was about 3% before the new tariffs have been imposed. But of course, now we don't know how high they are. But we know that they were approximately 3%. Now, one important thing that happened with the formation of the WTO was that a new mechanism was established to deal with disputes between countries concerning their trade policies, and this is what's known the dispute settlement mechanism. And this, unfortunately, mechanism survived until about 10 years ago, and it ran into big trouble since then. I'll perhaps come back to this later. However, as tariff declined, they didn't decline only in the US, they declined also in European countries and many other countries. They were increasingly replaced by what we call NTBs, non-tariff barriers. And this consists of anti-dumping fees, countervailing duties, and things of this sort. And in recent years, this dispute settlement mechanism that was formed in 1994 basically crumbled to a large extent due to the US, starting with the Obama administration, who refused to appoint judges to handle essentially this type of disputes, and it's really not very operative more recently. Now, the formation of the WTO also marked the end of major trade negotiations. The Uruguay round was the last round that the WTO, or the GATT at the time, conducted. And then as a result, countries started to sign free trade agreements in large number. Now, these free trade agreements often are what's called the regional trade agreements, but sometimes they are custom unions and free trade agreements, not necessarily between countries that are geographically nearby. So what you see in this graph is the proliferation of these free trade agreements. There's a difference between those who have been ratified and applied and those who have been essentially notified to the WTO. But whichever ones you look at, there has been a very fast increase, and those that are in force reached, the number is here 373, which is a very large number compared to what happened in the mid-90s when the WTO was formed. Now, there was a big debate in the 1980s whether these trade agreements improve economic efficiency and, more importantly, facilitate future reductions of barriers to trade. And this issue, frankly speaking, has never been resolved, and it's still disputed, although it's not a very active area of discussion. Now, despite all these gains that I have mentioned, namely growth, the reduction of poverty, a backlash against globalization has gained traction in public discourse with many embedded misconceptions. So I think many people don't understand the implications of this backlash and basically where it's coming from. An important one, I believe, which is often overlooked, is that while by some measures, support for international relations has declined. So, for example, the Pew found different evolutions of support and objection to trade. It remains, actually, the support for trade remains widespread. I sort of like to look at the Gallup surveys for a very simple reason, that they use the same question. They've used it for many years, starting from the early 90s. So what is the question? And I quote, they ask people the following question: what do you think foreign trade means for America? Do you see foreign trade more as an opportunity for economic growth through increased US exports, or a threat to the economy from foreign imports? And here is the evolution of the fraction of people who say that they think that trade promotes economic growth. So 44% of respondents in 1992 saw foreign trade as opportunity for economic growth, while 48, a larger number, perceived it as a threat to the economy. But by 2020, when we entered the pandemic, 79% viewed foreign trade as growth opportunity, while only 18% saw it as a threat to the economy. And then the pandemic brought about a decline in the support for foreign trade. But then, as you can see here, it picked up again. In the most recent survey, there are 80% who think that trade is good for growth. Okay, so people really think, except some politicians, that trade is good for growth. Now, the question then is, do they have some other thoughts which are relevant? And the answer is yes, and some of them are pretty conflicting. So, for example, in a 2023 survey by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, they found that 74% of Americans believed international trade benefited the US economy. But among the same people, 66% thought the tariffs are a good thing. Now, the issue really is, to some degree, how do we pose the question, and what do people have in mind when they try to answer the question? This is not a simple consideration, actually. And generally speaking, people are very concerned with jobs. And you hear it today, you could hear it 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and as far as you want to go to the back. So they sort of get a little bit more information about this. It's good to look at the large-scale surveys that my colleague Stephanie Stancheva has been performing for a number of years now. And she found that support for the liberal trade policies has somewhat been decreasing lately, but it's still pretty large. So here are the numbers coming from her surveys. So as you can see here, the share of respondents who agreed with the following statement. I wrote it down here, but I will also read it because it's important to see what the question is exactly. So they agreed that increasing trade I lost it here. Increasing trade with other countries and reducing barriers to trade is something the US should aim for. And the question is, do you agree with this statement or no? And the fraction of people who agreed with this statement declined from 69% in 2019 to 59 in 2020, 57 in 2023. But the important point to note is that despite the decline, it's still a majority of people. And it's not a negligible majority. But she also found that people who object to trade basically are concerned with one important thing, and this is whether government policies try to compensate people who are harmed by trade or whether they don't. So if the government will pursue policies that compensate people who are harmed by trade, the support for trade would be, of course, much, much bigger. And of course, there are big differences across countries. What types of policies are available for this purpose? So, for example, in the US, there is a program mandated by Congress, which is called Trade Adjustment Assistance. And this program, when it started, was reasonably large, but they never adjusted the sum of money. So inflation ate into it, and when problems arose, they really didn't have enough funds to support people who were harmed. Now, a major factor behind the decline in support for open trade was the COVID-19 pandemic. It triggered a shift in demand away from services towards demand for goods, because you couldn't really travel, you couldn't go on vacations, so people started to buy goods that they could use at home. And this was further exacerbated by the lockdowns in a variety of countries. Now, as a result, international shipping became overloaded, and production of goods struggled to keep pace with demand. And this led to these widespread shortages. Now, why is this important? Because this is the time when people started to look at global supply chains, or what we call global value chains. I don't know why the World Bank calls it global value chains. It's basically global supply chains. But they wrote a report in 2020, which the whole annual report was devoted to these chains. And they coined the term global value chains. And people noticed that these global value chains played a vital role in the disruptions. And so the point is the following, that if you look the evolution of world trade, the evolution of the global supply chains played a major role in enabling poorer countries to integrate into the world economy. And how did this happen? Because if you have a global supply chain with many stages, which was enabled by fragmentation of production, then countries at different levels of development can integrate into the global system at different stages of this chain. So this was very important. And when we look at it, then we see the rise of the share of trade along the supply chains as compared to total trade. And essentially what this graph, which was generated by the World Bank, shows is that about half of trade in manufacturers today takes place along these supply chains. For the economists in the audience, I'll explain one point about the construction of this graph. And this is the following, that they find that a product is traded along a supply chain, an international supply chain, if it crosses more than one border. in the process. So if you take, for example, a car seat produced in Turkey, and this car seat is imported into the US and installed in a car that's sold in the US, it will not appear in these numbers. But if the car is exported to, say, Austria, then this car seat cross two borders, one to the US, one to Austria, then it shows up in these numbers. And of course, there are components that cross more than two borders. Now, more than 2/3 of world trade consists of intermediate goods that have the ability to be traded along these chains. And the shortages experienced during and after the pandemic were widely seen at their time as failures of the supply chains. And this sort of reinforced the negative perception of international trade. Now, another interesting thing is the following. When you think about the shock that came from COVID-19, and I can say similar things about the financial crisis of 2008, both were pretty big shocks. But when you look at what happened to trade, you see that international trade has recovered very fast, actually. So, contrary to popular belief at the time, I would say that supply chains proved to be remarkably resilient. And yes, there were problems, but they didn't come from the supply chains. They came from the shock that occurred to the economy. Now, these supply chains have grown increasingly complex, and they involve numerous partners in different countries. So let me show you some features that, unless you look at the numbers, you would never guess what they are. So look here at General Motors in the upper left corner. So what this shows you is that General Motors has 856 first-tier suppliers. These are suppliers of parts and components to General Motors directly. But they also have more than 18,000 second-tier, third-tier, and higher-tier suppliers. We are talking about huge numbers of suppliers. And if you look at Boeing, for example, the numbers are huge. You see here at Airbus, they have about 1,600 first-tier suppliers and more than 12,000 higher-tier suppliers. So it's huge. I don't have time to go over every company on this figure. But generally speaking, many manufacturers, especially of sophisticated products, have a fair number of direct suppliers and many more second-tier and higher-tier suppliers. And this means that these products are produced with supplies along supply chains. Another interesting thing is what is the nature of the suppliers in the international context. So here we have a map which shows different colors, and the different colors indicate the integration of countries in different stages of the supply chains. So the dark blue shows countries which produce innovative activities. And as you can see, they are largely concentrated in North America and Europe. And then we have countries with a somewhat lighter blue. And these are countries that in Asia that play a big role in advanced manufacturing along these supply chains. Whereas in several African countries in South America, countries engage in more limited manufacturing along these supply chains. But for each one of these countries, the mere opportunity to participate in this type of supply chain is very important for the country, for its ability to reach bigger markets and to grow. The countries that grew the fastest by integrating in the supply chains are sort of, some of them are presented here. So you hear recently a lot about Vietnam. Vietnam, in fact, was the fastest integrator into supply chains. And then you have Cambodia, Ireland, and so on, and Mexico, and Morocco, and Turkey, lots of countries that grew their integration into these supply chains, played a big role in the development of their economy. Okay, so the shock to the supply chains during the pandemic, which triggered a sort of switch in public perception about the viability of these supply chains, was important, but the fact of the matter is that there were other shocks that were equally important. So, for example, there was a Japanese earthquake and tsunami in 2011, which had a very big effect. There was the floods in Thailand in the same year. They had a pretty devastating effect on the Japanese car industry because it relied heavily on components imported from Thailand. Then, during the pandemic, there was a shortage of semiconductors that lasted for a few years. In fact, I bought a car not long ago, like two years ago, I think. And I got the car with only one key because they didn't have a chip for a second key. I had to wait several months to get it. So this is the sort of level to which it came down. But the point I want to make is that disruptions are quite prevalent, and they are the normal stuff of business strategies. It's not that you don't have to wait for an earthquake in Japan or a pandemic to have to deal with disruptions. Business firms actually deal with disruptions all the time. So here we have estimates that come from a survey conducted by the McKinsey Global Institute of companies. It's a small sample, so it's, we have to discount the fact that it comes from a small sample. But the point is that according to this survey, companies experience supply chain disruptions with very varying durations quite often. So on average, they face 1 to 2 weeks of disruption every 2 years, 2 to 4 weeks every 3 years, and so on, as you see in this graph. The cost of this type of disruptions varies across sector. So, for example, aerospace is at the top there. The average cost over a 10-year period of this type of disruptions amounts to 67% of annual net earnings over a 10 period. Yes. So this is a pretty sizable impact. And in contrast, in pharmaceuticals, you can see here, it amounts only to 24% of earnings. And on average, across this industry, it amounts to 42%. So these are significant numbers. And you may wonder, why am I raising these issues here? Well, I'm raising it because of a very simple point. And this is that companies know that there are risks of disruption along supply chains. So they devise strategies to handle these type of risks. And the question then is, do they do it in an efficient manner, or should the government step in, as many governments decided to do? And can the governments improve on this type of risk managers? I'll come to this in a short while. Now, as you know, China's economic growth and increasing participation in international trade have raised widespread anxiety. This is very similar. I see some other people who have white heads, so they might remember that a very similar phenomena existed in the late 70s and early 80s concerning Japan. And if you didn't, if you were in kindergarten then, maybe you read some books later. The point is that it's not different in some ways, not always, but in some ways, from the reaction to the rise of Japan at the time. So this response was particularly strong in the United States. Now, since joining the WTO in 2001, China has rapidly expanded its exports. Its export had really boomed at the time. And in fact, it became the largest exporter in the world in 2009. And of course, it's today the largest exporter in the world. Now, over time, trade between the US and Japan, in China, has grown, but Chinese exports grew faster than US export to China. So the red bars represent exports of the US to China, and the blue bars, exports of China to the US, and you see that the Chinese exports grew faster than the American export, and this increased the US trade deficit, which is represented by the black graph below the zero. So this imbalance, which led to a widening of the US trade deficit with China, fueled economic and policy concerns in the US. And as you know, it has fueled the current US policy towards China and other countries. But the interesting thing is that if you think about this trade between the US and China, whether the US benefits from this trade despite the growing trade deficit or not, the answer is that yes, it benefits. So there are some estimates of this, and there's a nice set of estimates in a paper that was published a couple of years ago. And what this suggests is that US trade with China between 1995 and 2011 translates into benefits of about 3.4% of GDP for the US and about 4.6% of GDP for China. So this means that about 17% of US gains from trade overall are due to its trade with China, and China's benefits are about 10%. So yes, there is a trade imbalance, but this still generates beneficial exchanges. Now, as you know, I'm running out of time, huh? Okay. I'll have to skip some things. No, it's not okay. Okay, so I'm skipping a bunch of things that I wanted to talk about, but I want to make one point which I think is sort of important. And this is, I intended to talk about the Trump trade policy during his first period and essentially the tariff that they imposed in 2018. They they were pretty damaging, but not really huge. But the interesting point is that if you look at what happened when Trump was replaced by Biden, the first thing Biden did was he established a task force and issued an executive order he asked the task force to recommend policies that will strengthen the resilience of American supply chains. So a statement in this document says the United States needs resilient, diverse, and secure supply chains to ensure our economic prosperity, and I'm emphasizing national security. And this term national security looms very high in the policy debate. And it's sort of coming to haunt us in recent times even more. Many things have become national security issues. And the last sentence says resilient American supply chains will revitalize and rebuild domestic manufacturing capacity, maintain America's competitive edge in research and development, and create well-paying jobs. Everything will be wonderful. Okay, so these policies were elaborated over time by the then Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, who is a distinguished economist, and she taught me macroeconomics, so she must be very good, right? And she and the National Security Advisor, Jack Sullivan, they strongly emphasized national security considerations. And I intended to spend a little bit time on what she said in various speeches, but I think I'll have to skip it. Now, the US policy at the time, I'm talking about Biden times now, alarmed many countries in both Europe and Asia. So, for example, in an interview with The Economist, published in May last year, the French President Emmanuel Macron expressed deep concern about Europe's security in view of these American policies. And the potential consequences of escalating global tensions as a result of these policies. And he said, the Americans have stopped trying to get the Chinese to conform to the rules of international trade. And he called what's known as the Inflation Reduction Act of President Biden a conceptual revolution. And he accused America of being like China by subsidizing its critical industries. And he called for Europe to engage in industrial policy in response. So we get this, total escalation that comes from different places. And the national security-related trade concern became increasingly widespread. And how do we know it? If we look at the data on issues raised in the WTO, we see how national security considerations have been growing in the WTO committees. And of course, they have become central to geopolitical considerations. So then as now, a major concern in the US and in other countries is employment in manufacturing. But the difficulty here is the following, that if you look at US data, then employment in manufacturing has been declining for about 40 years. And the question that some economists try to entangle is how much of this decline is due to globalization, especially the growth of China. So people find some effects, but they are pretty modest. And most of this decline comes from automation, the use of robotics in production, and things of this sort. At the same time, well, trade restrictions have been growing. So if you look what happened after the financial crisis, we had a sort of approximately fixed number of trade restrictions imposed, and then they start to rise, and they are mostly concentrated in trade in goods, but surprisingly, many restrictions have been imposed also on trade in services. And as I said at the beginning, trade in services has become a much bigger component of international trade. And the shift reflects a growing trend towards protectionism. And again, it's driven mostly by concern of over national security, but of course, geopolitical considerations. So the other thing that is sort of interesting is that following this directive from the Biden administration and the shift in other countries, including Europe, the use of terms like reshoring, onshoring, and nearshoring spread very widely. And for example, if you look at corporate presentations, you can see how rapidly these terms have expanded, which means that many of the corporations became concerned both with the policy and what they can do about it. And then there are the geopolitical considerations. So increasingly, these considerations shape trade relations. The view why geopolitical considerations are important goes actually back to an outstanding book by Albert Hirschman from 1945, where he examined the behavior of Nazi Germany towards its supplier in Europe, like Romania, Hungary, the Czech Republic, and other. Well, since I don't have time to talk about it too much, what I want to point out only is that if you look in recent years how trade evolved within blocks, and basically think about two blocks, the American bloc and the Chinese bloc, then it's not dissimilar, although again the similarity is not very strong, to what happened during the Cold War. So what we see now is that trade within the blocks grows faster than trade across the blocks, and this sort of has an effect of about 12%. Okay, so tariffs imposed on intermediate inputs in supply chains, which is the majority of the tariff, for example, that President Trump imposed in 2018, they have very strong effects. And if you account for the fact that these tariffs were discriminatory, as the current suggestions are, you don't use the same tariff for every country, you impose different tariff rates on countries. This sort of forces companies to switch suppliers. And these switches are costly, and they raise substantially the cost of the tariff. So we, for example, estimated the effect of the Trump 2018 tariff, and we found that the cost was about $24 billion, which is about 3 times as high as estimates that don't account for this type of switching cost. The other thing which is sort of important is that if you look at this paper by Caselli, Koren, Lisitsky, and Tenrero, And I don't know if you want me to talk about your paper. It's okay? Okay. I'll talk about it. So they examined the relationship between trade openness and income volatility, particularly through the lens of increased specialization. And they found that while trade openness can heighten income volatility by essentially encouraging specialization, it can also reduce volatility when country-specific shocks are significant. Namely, you get disturbances within the country rather than in the international arena. In such cases, access to international markets actually help buffer domestic disturbances. And quantitatively, they've concluded that international trade has in fact reduced in economic volatility in most countries in their sample. Okay, I told only the truth, right? Okay. Now, moreover, as shown earlier, companies routinely face significant disruptions, and they obviously have strategies to handle these type of risks. So the question becomes, are private risk management strategies insufficient? And from a social perspective in particular, do firms invest too little? Do they invest too much? What do we know about it? So there are really no empirical studies, but in some work that I did with two colleagues, what we show is that theoretically, they can invest too much or too little in risk management, in the sense that they diversify suppliers across countries too much or too little, and that which way it goes depends on a variety of structural features of the economy. But I don't have time really to talk about it. So the last point I want to make is, what are the costs of separations, essentially, in foreign trade? So we don't have excellent estimates, but we have a variety of estimates, and they differ in methodology, they differ in what they account for, and so on. So here we have a sort of bunch of these estimates, and to get a sense of how large this thing can be, so the cost of trade fragmentation can range from 0.2% of GDP to close to 7% of GDP. 7% is already a pretty large number. But the losses rise to an upper bound of 8.5% when accounting for sectoral misallocation, this sort of inefficiencies that exist across sectors, and reduce knowledge diffusion. So this, you should know, again, that there are pretty reliable estimates that knowledge diffusion across countries plays a big role in promoting productivity. And most of R&D and innovation is concentrated in rich countries, but many poorer countries benefit from this innovation through these spillovers that have been estimated. Okay, so the question now is, and this is the last slide I want to show before I conclude, is if we dismantle the current system, which countries will suffer the most? So one way to address this issue is to look at what happened to the fraction of trade conducted by a variety of countries. So what you have here is the high-income countries are the orange bars to the left, and then the lower middle-income countries are the green bars here. I don't know if you see green or you see some other color, but it's here, okay? So basically, if you look at the world economy, you see a contraction of the rich countries and expansion of the lower middle income countries. Now, the lower middle income countries are pretty poor. They have an income per capita of something between $1,000, $1,100, and $4,500. So they are pretty poor. They were the big beneficiary of the supply chains and the integration into the world system, as I showed you also about the growth in activities along supply chains of these countries earlier on. So these are the countries that basically are going to suffer most from the fragmentation of production. Okay, so to conclude, the global economy faces substantial risks from the erosion of the liberal rule-based international order. Uncoordinated industrial and trade policies coupled with increasing political fragmentation into clubs, the US club and the China club in particular, pose very serious threats to the global trade and investment. And also global value chains, and I want to emphasize it, may not have always operated at big efficiency. They have demonstrated notable resilience and performance in recent years, both during the pandemic and during the financial crisis. And businesses already factor supply chain risk into their strategies, and it remains very uncertain how government intervention can improve risk management. I think I see many students here. This is a good topic for dissertations. Additionally, foreign trade has helped reduce income volatility, and trade restrictive policy targeting supply chains can lead to very significant economic losses from existing estimates, even though they are not all similar, but they are a pretty large number, with lower middle income countries being particularly vulnerable. So if you care about world poverty and poor countries, you should be very concerned about it. So obviously, to avoid fragmentation and preserve the benefits of global trade, I hope that I convince you that there were benefits. International cooperation in policy design is actually essential. Unfortunately, current trends suggest the pendulum is swinging in the opposite direction. And I, as a trade theorist, am very sad about it. Thank you.